Hi, welcome back. So today we're going to cover the last half of the section on call signs, which we started yesterday. So let's jump right in. Now, last lesson we talked a lot about identifying on the air, and we learned that you have to say your call sign on ham radio every 10 minutes during a contact and at the end of your contact. Now, it turns out there's one more thing you need to know about identifying, and that's when you identify, you have to identify and say your call sign in English. You can't use another language like Spanish or French, even if you're talking to someone who lives in Spain or France. Now, just to be clear, you're allowed to talk in other languages during other times when you're not identifying. If you're talking to someone in Spain, you can feel free to talk to them in Spanish, but when you identify yourself by saying your call sign, you have to say that in English. So you have to identify in English, and that's very important. So you can write that in your notebook. So that's enough about identifying, though. Now we're going to talk about some national and international rules that you have to be aware about for the technician test. Now, it turns out that in ham radio, the United States is split into 10 sections, or 10 districts. And what do I mean by that? Well, just as there are 50 states that make up the United States of America, there are 10 ham radio districts that also make up the USA. For example, the USA has been divided into 10 districts, so New York and New Jersey make up one district, Michigan and Ohio make up another district, etc., etc. So it's almost like states, but it's like sections, and we call them districts. So the districts are numbered from 0 to 9. There are 10 of them, and so they're numbered 0 to 9. And actually, the interesting thing is the number you are assigned in your call sign, if you'll remember, your call sign has a number in the middle. That number in your call sign corresponds to the section where you live. For example, I live in New York, and New York is in District 2. Hence, my call sign has the number 2, KD2 EOM. That's actually where they get that number. And there's something that hams do when they transmit outside their district in another district. See, what if I go outside New York and I go into Pennsylvania, which is District 3? Then what do I do? Well, you can transmit when you transmit in another district, you can say something like stroke W3 or slant W3 or slash W3 after your call sign. Meaning I might, instead of just saying I am KD2 EOM, when I'm in Pennsylvania District 3, I might say, hello, this is KD2 EOM stroke W3 or slant W3 or slash W3. So what's that called at the end, that suffix, that stroke W3 or slant W3, that's what's known as an indicator in ham radio. And it's called that because it indicates extra information about you. Namely, the stroke means that the indicator is starting, and then the number 3 says you're in District 3, and the W is, I'm not really actually sure why the W is in there. A lot of people leave out the W. It's just sort of become a part of the indicator. So it isn't really there for a specific reason. But anyway, if I live in District 2, but I operate in District 4, say, I can say KD2 EOM stroke W4. And those indicators aren't actually required, though. They're just something that people do. They're optional, although you do have to know about them for the test, because there are test questions on that. But no indicator like that is really required if you operate outside of a certain district. Now, there are certain indicators which are required, and those are the slash KT, the slash AE, and the slash AG indicators, which you sometimes have to put at the end of the call sign. So what in the world are these? What does that mean? Why do these exist? Well, it turns out after you get your technician class license and maybe you decide to upgrade to the general class license, which is the next higher level license, it turns out you can actually start operating with your new general class privileges right after passing your general class exam, even before your license upgrade is processed in the FCC database. So the only condition to this is that you have to put the word slash AG at the end of your call sign in order to let everyone know that even though you're a technician, you have a right to operate as a general class because your general license is being processed. And this is different from when you get your technician license. When you get your technician license, you have to wait actually until it's been processed in the FCC database. But actually for upgrades, it's a little different. You can begin operating on your new privileges right away. You just have to put one of these indicators on. So this slash AG indicator is what you use when you upgrade to a general, hence the G. The slash AE indicator is what you use when you upgrade to an extra, that's slash AE. And this one, you'll notice this is a T. Does that mean is that when you become a technician? Well, you have to remember again, there are different kinds of licenses and some of them aren't offered anymore. And I believe this was used by what we call the novice class license, which isn't available anymore. But when they upgraded, they would use slash KT to say they now had technician privileges. But you don't have to worry about this. This doesn't really apply to you. You just need to know about it for the test. So now let's move away from national practices and talk about some international rules. So let's start out with this one question. Who makes the international rules? We know the FCCC is a government agency. They handle the US rules, but who makes the international rules? Well, this is the job of what we call the ITU, And we've talked a little bit about the ITU. The ITU stands for the International Telecommunications Union. And one interesting thing about it is it's actually related to the United Nations. And this provides a very handy trick to remember about what the ITU deals with. Because you can remember that because the ITU and the United Nations are both international, then they're sort of related to each other. And we'll see in a minute how this is useful. But the ITU deals with information and communication technology issues. So the reason it's useful to relate the ITU and the United Nations together is because you might actually get questions on your test that ask, what is the ITU? And some of the answers actually involve the United Nations. So in fact, let's look at one of these questions. Actually, there is only one question about this, but it reads, what is the ITU? And again, there are 4 choices, multiple choice. A, an agency of the United States Department of Telecommunications Management. B, a United Nations agency for information and communication technology issues. C, an independent frequency coordination agency. Or D, a department of the FCC. And of course, the answer is A. So all you have to do is remember the United Nations trick, and you'll be okay. Just equate the International Telecommunications Union with the United Nations, and remember they're both about international, so they're related. And you'll be able to answer this question. So remember, all of these choices will be the same on your actual test. If you get a question about what is the ITU on your technician exam, it will have these same choices. Of course, you might not get this question on your test because there are 426 questions and they only pull 35 of those out of the pool for your test. But if you do happen to get this question, you'll be ready to answer it. And by the way, choice C in this question is also wrong because the ITU does more than just coordinate frequencies. And we're going to learn what else they do in a minute. But first, I'd like to go back to something about the ITU and talk about there's what we call ITU regions. So just as we learned the United States is divided into 10 districts, the ITU actually divides the whole world, the whole planet Earth, into 3 regions. And the United States, just for your information, is in region 2 because it's in the middle of the map. So I don't have a map of the world here, but if we had a map of the world, this is region 1, that's region 2, United States is somewhere in there, and then we have region 3. So it turns out each region of the ITU, each of the 3 different regions has different frequency assignments, meaning they have different rules on which frequencies on the radio hams are allowed to operate on. And because of this, it turns out ships and boats sailing on the water actually have different frequency assignments throughout the world, or depending on where they're sailing. Yes, it turns out you can operate ham radio on a boat, and that's actually called maritime mobile. And actually, I want you to write that down, that maritime mobile refers to operating ham radio on boats or ships. The test actually expects you to know that. Anyway, though, getting back on track, so some U.S. territories also have different frequency assignments for the same reason. Even though U.S. territories like Puerto Rico are all in part of the United States, some territories, like not Puerto Rico, but other territories, some of them are in different ITU regions. And so they have to follow different rules about which frequencies they can operate on ham radio. And that's also very important to know. So now let's discuss talking to people in other countries, which is something maybe you've been really excited about, and we're finally getting to that now. Now, it turns out you are not allowed to talk to other countries that have notified the ITU that it objects to those communications. So there are certain countries that tell the ITU, we don't want anyone to talk to us, so they forbid that, and you're not allowed to talk to those countries. But you actually don't have to worry too much about this rule because there are actually only 2 countries in the world that have objected like this. And those 2 countries are North Korea, which there are no hams there anyway. Ham radio is actually banned in North Korea, so you couldn't talk to them even if you wanted to, which you probably wouldn't want to. And the other country is called Eritrea, in some obscure country. I don't even know where Eritrea is, or even if I pronounced it correctly. So basically the point is, most of the countries in the world that you're going to talk to on ham radio, they are going to be fine with you talking to them, with foreign countries like that. So you don't really have to worry about this rule. The only reason you have to worry about it is because there might be questions on it on your technician test. But other than that, you can just talk to other countries internationally like normal, almost as if you were talking to someone in the United States. You don't have to follow any special kinds of rules. You do have to remember, though, the similar rules as when you're talking to people in the United States apply, meaning you're still not allowed to use ham radio for your business. Ham radio, you have to always remember, ham radio is about transmissions of personal nature, meaning you're just talking to people for fun because you want to, it's your personal desire to do that. So I want to now look at a sample question that you might run into on the test that asks about this. And this question says, what types of international communications are permitted by an FCC-licensed amateur station? Choice A, communications incidental to the purposes of the amateur service and remarks of a personal character. B, communications incidental to conducting business or remarks of a personal nature. C, only communications incidental to contest exchanges, all other communications are prohibited. Or choice D, any communications that would be permitted by an international broadcast station. And obviously, choice A is the correct answer. Choice B, we can immediately eliminate. No business communications are allowed on ham radio. Choice C is also out. Ham radio is about more than just participating in contests. By the way, a ham radio contest is where you try to contact as many other ham radio operators as possible as you can in a limited amount of time. That's what we mean with contesting. But ham radio is about much more than just contesting. Ham radio is also just about talking to people for fun, as we've been saying all along. And choice D is also wrong because ham radio is not international broadcast. Those are separate. So choice D, any communication that would be permitted by an international broadcast station, that's an incorrect choice. Choice A is the correct answer. Now you'll notice choice B is close because choice B also says that, also mentions remarks of a personal nature, but because of that business part, that eliminates choice B. Choice A is the correct answer for this question. So on a similar note, you are allowed to operate your ham radio actually in a foreign country. If you happen to travel to Europe, say, you can sometimes take your ham radio and operate in a foreign country. And you can do that as long as that foreign country allows you to do that, as long as they're okay with that. And I want you to take a note of that as well, as there are test questions on almost everything we've been going over so far. Now, it turns out, this is very interesting, you're even allowed to transmit on a boat, which we sort of talked about. That's called maritime mobile. And that's pretty cool, isn't it? So how does that work? Like, what if it's a big boat, like a cruise ship? And what happens if the boat sails off to some other country outside the United States? So then what do? What are the rules? How are you supposed to go about that? Well, it turns out that you're actually allowed to transmit on any boat that's registered in the United States, even if the boat goes outside the United States. So if you're licensed in the United States and you take a cruise ship from the United States to England, as long as that cruise ship is registered in the United States, you can still operate on that cruise ship while you are in England, which is pretty cool. Okay, so we're almost done with this video lecture, and there's just a couple more things I want to talk about. So we're going to talk about now about non-licensed people who don't have ham radio license. So you might be wondering, well, what's the point of that? I mean, what can they have to do with the test? They don't have licenses, they can't operate, right? Well, actually, non-licensed persons can operate under some circumstances. Turns out they can operate under your call sign when you get licensed, as long as you're sitting right next to them and you're supervising them. So a non-licensed person can operate on ham radio as long as they're under the supervision of a licensed person, and then they use the licensed person's call sign, which is pretty cool, but there are limitations, especially when those non-licensed people try to talk to people in other countries. Now, due to some weird laws that some other countries have, non-licensed hams using your station and call sign can only talk to foreign countries that have what we call third-party agreements. So what in the world is a third-party agreement? What does that mean? Well, some governments don't really like the thought of non-licensed people or people they call third parties because they're third parties. They don't have ham radio licenses, so they're called third parties. They're trying to get on ham radio. They don't like those third parties, the idea of them operating on ham radio. So they think that this sort of behavior, allowing non-licensed people to operate on ham radio, might present harmful competition for their commercial radio communications. I don't know, maybe they think that the non-licensed third-party people are trying to use ham radio for commercial use as a way to pass on business messages using ham radio, and so they're trying to use the licensed person as a gateway to get into ham radio and transmit messages for their businesses. Anyway, whatever those countries do think, the one thing is for sure. The fact is that you are forbidden to allow a non-licensed ham to contact foreign countries in this way unless there is a third-party agreement in place that permits what's called third-party traffic, which is basically communications from that third party or from that non-licensed ham. So you can only transmit third-party communications to stations whose government allows it. And if you're wondering, well, how am I supposed to know which governments allow it? There's a list of countries that have such agreements with the United States in your technician class manual, in your Gordon West manual. So you can look at that on your own if you'd like.